Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move. There's been a mistake with your seat. The words cut through the cabin like a sharp knife, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. Heads turned, phones tilted upward. A ripple of whispers filled the air. In row 2A, a black woman in a tailored beige suit froze, her boarding pass still in her hand. Valerie Parker, CEO, dealmaker, builder of a billion-dollar empire, suddenly looked at this crowd like just another passenger who didn't belong. The flight attendant's voice carried that polished airline tone, but it was cold, clipped, and deliberate. Her name tag read Karen, and she stood rigid. A faint smile stretched across her face as if this humiliation was standard procedure. "You'll need to step aside before boarding security gets involved," she added, even louder this time. A hush fell. It wasn't just an instruction. It was an accusation. Valerie's heart raced, though her face stayed calm. She held up her ticket, steady and clear. Seat 2A, first class. Every letter visible. Every digit printed. Evidence no one could ignore. Karen didn't flinch. She didn't even look. "Our system says otherwise," she declared, her hand motioning to the aisle. "We got another passenger for this seat." And this time, the humiliation was complete. A white man in a rumpled gray suit, standing a few rows back, smirked and adjusted his tie as Karen waved him forward. It wasn't just a seat change anymore. It was a public removal. One woman stripped of her place. One man invited to take it. But here's the twist. That man wasn't a stranger. He wasn't just some lucky traveler getting an upgrade. He was Mark Jensen, the lead negotiator from the very company Valerie was about to acquire in a $2 billion deal. He smirked because he thought this was leverage. He smirked because the cabin now saw him as the rightful occupant and Valerie as a disruption. So here's the question I want to ask you. If you were in Valerie's place, standing in first class with proof in your hand, being told to leave anyway, would you fight back or would you stay silent? The aisle stretched like a runway, but it felt more like a courtroom. Every passenger was a witness, their eyes sharp with judgment. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, hungry for drama. First class had turned into a silent jury box. The cabin itself played its role. Soft leather seats, champagne flutes on polished trays, glowing screens tucked neatly into each headrest. The environment screamed exclusivity, yet had no room for Valerie's presence. These rows of luxury became invisible cages, where stares judged more than words. Valerie didn't move. She wasn't reckless. She knew scenes like this were traps. Raise your voice, and suddenly you're the angry black woman. Show too much patience, and you become invisible. She stood in that dangerous middle ground where every second stretched. Karen leaned closer, lowering her voice but sharpening her words. "Ma'am, this isn't personal. It's operational necessity. Please comply." That corporate phrase, operational necessity, carried the weight of a weapon. Behind it was the unspoken message. Our system is bigger than you. Valerie's lips pressed tight. She thought of the long week behind her. The late-night negotiations, the brutal back and forth, the careful maneuvering that brought her to this very morning. This flight was supposed to be her victory lap. Instead, it became a public trial, and the jury had already chosen sides. Passengers whispered, but no one spoke out loud. A woman 2 rows up exchanged a sympathetic glance, but her eyes dropped the moment Valerie looked back. A man across the aisle raised his phone, not to help, but to record. In that instant, Valerie wasn't a CEO. She was content, a headline in the making. Mark stepped forward, his smirk never fading. He slid into the conversation with false politeness. "If it helps, I don't mind taking the seat. She can have mine in the back." His voice was dripping with condescension, but to the audience, it sounded like generosity. Karen smiled at him as if he were saving the day. Valerie's chest burned, but her voice remained level. She spoke clearly, though not loudly. "This is my seat. My boarding pass says 2A. There's no mistake." She extended the slip of paper again, daring Karen to glance at it. Karen didn't. Instead, she looked past Valerie, motioning again for Mark. "Sir, right this way. Thank you for your patience." The humiliation deepened. It wasn't just denial anymore. It was dismissal. Proof in hand meant nothing when authority had already decided she didn't belong. The ticket might as well have been blank. The whispers grew louder. One passenger muttered, "Just let it go." Another whispered, "Why is she making this a scene?" They weren't talking about Karen. They weren't talking about the man sliding into first class. They were talking about Valerie, the one forced to defend what was already hers. Valerie felt the sting, not just as a personal insult, but as a reminder of a larger truth. In elite spaces, proof rarely mattered. Status didn't shield you. A uniform carried more power than years of achievement. One voice could strip away dignity in seconds. She breathed in slowly, willing her face to stay calm. She knew she was at the edge of a dangerous line. Step too far, and she'd be labeled unfit, unstable, unworthy. Step back, and she'd vanish into silence. The humiliation stamped on her name. Mark leaned against the seat, watching like a predator circling its prey. He thought this was his win, that by stripping her of this seat, the balance in their upcoming deal had shifted in his favor. But Valerie wasn't about to explode. Not here. Not yet. She studied Karen's face, the cabin, the watching eyes. Then she lowered her ticket slowly, slipped it into her bag, and without another word, she turned not defeated, but calculating. She took one small step toward the aisle, as if conceding. Karen's smirk sharpened, Mark's shoulders loosened, and a jury of first-class passengers silently judged her exit. What no one realized was this. The move Valerie made wasn't surrender. It was the quiet signal of a storm about to break. And as she reached for her phone, screen glowing in her palm, the entire cabin leaned in, waiting for the outburst they thought was coming. But what she did next would silence them all. Valerie didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she did the most rational thing anyone could do. She held up her boarding pass, steady and visible like a shield. "Seat 2A," she said calmly, her voice low but firm. "This is my seat." The slip of paper was undeniable. Black ink on white stock, clear as daylight. It was proof, the kind of proof that should have ended the conversation right there. But Karen, the flight attendant with a practiced smile and clipped tone, didn't even bother to look. She tilted her chin slightly, like proof didn't matter. "Ma'am, our system says otherwise," she replied. Her words carried an icy finality, as if the screen in the back galley carried more weight than the boarding pass in Valerie's hand. Passengers nearby leaned closer, their curiosity sharpened by tension. They saw the ticket. They saw the refusal. They saw the balance tip towards something uglier than a seating mix-up. This is where the humiliation deepened. Not because Valerie lacked evidence, but because evidence itself was dismissed. What did it mean when truth printed on paper could be ignored just because of who was holding it? Imagine this. You show your receipt at the store, but the cashier won't even glance. You flash your ID at the door, but the guard looks through you as if you're invisible. Have you ever felt that sting, when proof isn't enough because they've already decided you don't belong? That was the battlefield in row 2A. Valerie held the boarding pass a second longer, steady, unshaking, daring Karen to meet her eyes. But Karen's gaze slid past, not out of oversight, but out of choice. Authority was her shield, and she used it like a weapon. Operational necessity, Karen added smoothly, the corporate phrase polished until it gleamed. That word, necessity, disguised humiliation as procedure. The cabin wasn't hearing prejudice. They were hearing policy. And policy always sounds like law. Valerie lowered the ticket slowly, her face unreadable. But inside, heat pressed against her ribs. Every muscle told her to resist, to demand recognition. Yet she knew the game. Black women who protested too loudly were instantly painted as unstable, difficult, angry. That stereotype hung over her like a waiting trap. Meanwhile, the white man in the rumpled gray suit, Mark Jensen, leaned in from behind. His smirk widened as Karen gestured for him to wait. He didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. To the passengers, it looked like generosity. He was being given the seat, she was being asked to leave. But in truth, he saw this as leverage, a gift-wrapped opportunity delivered midair. The audience in first class shifted uncomfortably. A woman in pearls whispered, She should just move. A man in a business jacket muttered, "Why make this harder?" Nobody said out loud, but their silence screamed a verdict. Valerie was a problem, not the process. And here's the bitter irony. This wasn't just about a seat. First class itself became a symbol. Rows of polished leather and champagne flutes turned into silent walls that boxed Valerie out. These weren't just seats. They were gatekeepers, barriers reminding her that her presence had to be justified, even proven. And still it wasn't enough. The boarding pass slipped back into her purse. To the bystanders, it looked like surrender. But was it? As she straightened her jacket and exhaled slowly, the power dynamic in that cabin seemed settled. Karen believed she had won. Mark believed he had gained. The jury of passengers believed they had seen justice through policy. But here's the question. When a black CEO shows proof and is still dismissed, what hope does anyone else have? And more importantly, what happens when the proof she hides isn't paper but power? Valerie's hand brushed against her phone. She hadn't used it yet. Not once. But the quiet way she rested her fingers on it was enough to send a silent message. Something bigger was coming. And just as Karen leaned back with a satisfied nod, the intercom clicked on with a crisp chime. A voice began to speak. But what it said would flip the tension in that cabin on its head. The tension in the cabin should have ended the moment Valerie held up her ticket. Seat 2A, first class. Proof as solid as paper can be. But instead of acknowledging it, Karen crossed her arms, her smile thinning into something sharp, and muttered the corporate shield word everyone in first class had heard before. Operational necessity. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. That phrase didn't mean fair. It meant final. Valerie held her ground, voice steady but low. The ticket says 2A. That's where I'm sitting. Karen gave a theatrical sigh, as though dealing with a stubborn child. Then she snapped her fingers toward the galley. Another attendant appeared, taller, with a badge gleaming under the cabin lights. He moved with the slow, heavy confidence of someone summoned not to solve, but to enforce. The second attendant leaned down, looked at Karen, then looked at Valerie, and without even scanning the boarding pass in her hand, announced, "Ma'am, if you don't comply, we may need to delay this flight." That word, delay, made the cabin stir. You could hear the whispers, the faint clicks of phones being unlocked. Passengers weren't thinking about fairness now. They were thinking about time misconnections, business meetings slipping away. And just like that, the black woman in seat 2A became not a customer, but a problem. Valerie noticed it in their eyes. Some carried quiet sympathy, lips pressed tight, brows furrowed. A woman 2 rows back mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," when Karen wasn't looking. But others looked grateful it wasn't them in the spotlight, grateful that the storm had chosen another target. And in that strange way racism always works, the silence of the cabin became part of the enforcement. "Ma'am," the second attendant repeated, louder this time, as if volume could manufacture truth, "your seat assignment has been changed. We'll find you another spot." Another spot. In coach. Valerie could almost hear the unspoken sentence. Be grateful we're letting you stay on the plane at all. Have you ever been in a moment where the proof in your hand, the evidence so clear it could blind the sun, still meant nothing? Where authority decided it didn't need to see, because it had already judged. That was Valerie's reality. Standing there with her boarding pass, invisible in plain sight, Karen and her ally weren't just denying a seat. They were rewriting reality in real time. Every second Valerie stayed firm made her the disruptive passenger. Every word she spoke risked being labeled aggressive. And the smirking man across the aisle, Mark Jensen, watched the performance like it was a game scripted for his advantage. The second attendant gave one last look, stiff with the false patience of someone waiting to call on the captain. "Last chance, ma'am. Move, or we'll escalate further." The cabin froze, everyone waiting for the explosion, the shouting, the scene that would confirm the stereotype they were already whispering about. But what happened next wasn't noise. It was silence. A silence so deliberate it scared the cabin more than raised voices ever could. Because Valerie didn't move. And she didn't speak. She just looked at them, calm, unblinking. And then, slowly, she began to rise from her seat. The question burned in the air. Was she surrendering or setting a trap? The second attendant's words landed like a hammer. Last chance, ma'am. If you don't comply, we'll have to remove you from this aircraft. Removed. Not asked, not resettled. Removed. The word carried more weight than the champagne glasses clinking 2 rows away, more weight than the polished leather seat she had paid for. In that moment, Valerie Parker, CEO, dealmaker, builder of a billion-dollar company, was being framed not as a passenger, not even as a problem to be solved, but as a threat to be discarded. The cabin froze. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Every set of eyes locked onto her, waiting to see what she would do. Some passengers looked down, pretending to scroll their phones. Others stared openly, curiosity tinged with something colder. Relief that it wasn't them. This was the cruel theater of discretion. The attendants weren't yelling. They weren't swearing. They weren't breaking the script. They spoke in clipped, professional tones. Operational necessity. Policy enforcement. Words designed to sanitize humiliation. But everyone watching could feel the subtext. You don't belong here. You never did. Valerie's boarding pass, still in her hand, had become invisible. Proof meant nothing when the authority enforcing the rules refused to see it. And here's the bitter truth. In spaces like first class, perception was stronger than evidence. A uniform could erase a ticket. A cold smile could erase a career's worth of success. Have you ever felt that? Where no matter how much you've achieved, one accusation, one assumption, can strip it all away. Mark Jensen, slouched smugly across the aisle, leaned back with satisfaction. To him, this was a jackpot. His rival in negotiations was being reduced, humiliated, diminished before his very eyes. He thought the deal would be easier now. He thought she was about to explode, to shout, to fall into the trap that would brand her as difficult. But Valerie didn't shout. She sat still, breathing slowly, like someone balancing on the edge of a knife. The second attendant leaned closer, lowering his voice but keeping it sharp. If you refuse to comply, security will meet you at the gate. Do you understand? Security. The word sliced through the cabin, sending a ripple of discomfort through first class. Because everyone knew what that meant. Handcuffs. Headlines. A black woman dragged off a plane while cell phones recorded every second. Valerie's jaw tightened. In that instant, it became clear. This was a point of no return. She could surrender, slide into coach, and vanish into silence. Or she could stand firm and risk being branded the angry black woman, the disruption, the one who delayed the flight. Either way, her dignity was under attack. The attendants waited. The passengers waited. Mark Jensen waited. And then, without a word, Valerie placed her boarding pass back into her purse. She reached for her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, deliberate and calm. The entire cabin leaned in, straining to see. Because whatever she was about to do next, it wouldn't be ordinary. Valerie didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't even demand to see the captain. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, every movement deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to match her breathing. Her silence was sharper than any word she could have thrown. The flight attendant, satisfied, gave her a clipped nod and turned her attention back to the white man now sliding into Valerie's seat. He grinned, stretching out, as if first class had been reserved for him all along. The cabin exhaled, thinking the storm was over. But Valerie wasn't done, not even close. She stepped aside, leaned against the bulkhead, and slipped her phone from her bag. No grand gestures, no flailing hands. Just a quiet unlocking of the screen, her thumb hovering for a moment before pressing a single contact. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke so softly that even the passengers in row 3, straining to eavesdrop, heard nothing but a faint murmur. A few tilted their heads, disappointed. They had expected drama, not discretion. To them, it looked like a woman calling her lawyer to complain, maybe to file a report after landing, maybe to vent. To the casual eye, it was powerless, a formality, not a threat. But Mark Jensen saw something different. Sitting 2 rows across, his smirk never left his face. He thought he understood the game. To him, Valerie's silence was weakness. Her phone call was desperation. And desperation was leverage. He watched carefully, convinced this humiliation would follow her into the negotiating room. He pictured headlines. CEO removed from flight after disruptive incident. He imagined his opening line in the boardroom. Calm, patronizing, reminding her that professionalism matters. Mark leaned back, smug, as if the universe had handed him a golden card. His company, drowning in red ink, needed this deal. And here was Valerie, looking small, cornered, exposed. He believed the balance of power had shifted forever, but the truth was hidden in plain sight. Valerie wasn't calling a lawyer. She wasn't calling customer service. She wasn't even calling her assistant. She was reaching higher, much higher. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, her tone steady, her words precise. And then, after less than 30 seconds, she ended the call. No anger, no sigh, no visible trace of what had been said. Just calm, too calm. It unsettled the few passengers still watching. Some whispered to each other. Why didn't she push harder? Why didn't she argue? They couldn't see it, but she had already made her move. Have you ever seen someone so calm that it scared you more than shouting ever could? That was Valerie now. A woman denied her dignity in public, but carrying a secret weight that no one in that cabin could measure. The attendants carried on with service. Mark pulled out his laptop, pretending to work, but really watching her every move. He thought he had won. He thought she was finished. But less than 2 minutes later, his phone, resting smugly on his tray table, began to vibrate. Once, then again, then violently, as if the entire device had been thrown into panic. He frowned, confused. The screen lit up with a name he could not ignore. His face paled. And in that moment, Mark Jensen realized, whatever call Valerie had just made, it wasn't ordinary. Phones appeared like weapons drawn in the silence of first class. Fingers hovered over record buttons. Screens angled discreetly at Valerie. Some passengers filmed out of curiosity, others out of cruelty, and a few with quiet solidarity. In that moment, her dignity wasn't just challenged, it was broadcast. Karen, the flight attendant with a frozen smile, pretended not to notice the glow of cameras capturing every second. She still stood tall, her authority stitched neatly into her uniform. But the lens told another story. Every glare, every clipped word, every dismissive wave of her hand was being archived forever. Valerie remained calm, almost too calm, as though she understood something no one else in that cabin did. She held her phone low, her face unreadable, and that silence unnerved the smirking man in the rumpled suit across the aisle. He thought he was watching her humiliation, not realizing the world was about to watch his too. Within minutes, signals bounced through the air. Passengers uploaded clips before the plane door even closed. The caption spread like wildfire. Black woman denied her first-class seat. Mistake or racism? She showed her ticket. They still kicked her out. On Twitter, hashtags began to trend. On TikTok, edits appeared with dramatic music, bold letters flashing across the screen. System says otherwise. Thousands of strangers, sitting in offices, classrooms, and homes, were now witnesses to a humiliation the airline insisted was just an operational necessity. Back in the cabin, though, nothing had changed. Valerie stood aside, her seat surrendered, the whispers behind manicured hands still slicing through the air. The digital uproar was invisible here. The cabin remained a frozen theater of judgment. Silent passengers, a triumphant attendant, and one woman refusing to play the role assigned to her. But then, Mark Jensen's phone lit up. Just once. A vibration so sharp it made him flinch. He glanced down, expecting nothing more than a routine update. Instead, what he saw drained the smirk right off his face. And that, right there, was the moment the balance of power began to shift. Mark Jensen leaned back in his stolen first-class seat, his smirk carved deep, like he had already won. Valerie stood quiet in the aisle, her phone still in hand, her face unreadable to him. She looked small, defeated, a black woman pushed out of her place in a world of luxury where he believed she never truly belonged. But arrogance has a way of blinding men like Mark. And within minutes, the cracks in his little victory began to split wide open. It started with a buzz. His phone vibrated once, then again, then so hard against the tray table it rattled the champagne flute in front of him. He frowned and flipped it over, expecting some routine notification. Instead, his entire face drained of color. On the screen was a text from his CEO. For words, it hit harder than any shouting match Valerie could have thrown. What did you do? Before Mark could even process, another message lit up. Do not anger her. Fix this now. His smirk evaporated. His chest tightened. He looked up, suddenly aware that the room had shifted, though nothing in the cabin had actually changed. The first-class seats were still lined in quiet luxury, the passengers still whispering in low tones, pretending to sip coffee, pretending not to watch. But Mark, he was no longer in control of the scene. Something invisible had tilted the power in the room. And then came the third message, longer, more desperate. She holds the deal. Without her, we collapse. Mark's throat went dry. He glanced toward Valerie, who stood near the galley, posture calm, phone lowered now, as though nothing in the world could touch her. It hit him in that instant. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't stranded. She was holding a kind of leverage he hadn't even imagined. The whispers in the cabin blurred into a low hum, the sound of 100 silent judgments pressing on him instead of her. Suddenly, he wasn't a man watching a black woman humiliated. He was a man about to be humiliated in ways money couldn't patch. Just then, one of his colleagues, a mid-level manager from his company seated farther back in business class, shuffled forward. His face was pale, his hands shaking, phone in hand. He bent close and whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Mark, do you even realize who she is?" Mark turned, annoyed, still rattled. "She's some passenger," he muttered, but the words felt brittle even as he said them. The manager's eyes widened. "That's Valerie Parker, CEO of Parker Technologies, the acquisition target, the only reason our company is still breathing." The name landed like a thunderclap in Mark's ears. Valerie Parker. He'd heard it tossed around in strategy rooms, whisper with both fear and respect in board meetings. She wasn't just some executive. She was a woman holding the pen that could either sign their survival or sink them into bankruptcy. The blood drained from his face as the truth sank in. Every passenger's phone around him buzzed with a trending clip. Black CEO denied seat in first class. Meanwhile, his own phone screamed with warnings from the very top of his company. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. The humiliation he thought he had witnessed was, in fact, a live test of who truly held power. And he had just failed it. Mark's eyes darted back to Valerie. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't making a scene. She was simply waiting, composed, unmoved, and that silence was louder than anything he could muster. Imagine this. One moment you're sure someone is beneath you, and the next you realize your entire career, your company's very existence, sits in the palm of the person you disrespected. What would you do? Would you beg? Would you deny? Or would you sit frozen? Just like Mark, realizing the game had flipped and you were the pawn? As the cabin's energy thickened, the hum of whispers grew louder. The first-class stage had transformed again. But this time, the spotlight wasn't on Valerie. It was burning hot on Mark. And then, just as his pulse began to race out of control, Valerie slowly lifted her phone again, her thumb gliding across the screen with a calm that was almost chilling. Was she about to end the deal right there, mid-flight? Phones buzzed like alarms across boardrooms thousands of miles away. In New York, in San Francisco, in offices where glass walls usually meant control, chaos now spilled unchecked. One viral clip of a black woman denied her seat in first class was spreading faster than any press release could contain. And this wasn't just any passenger. This was Valerie Parker, the CEO holding the pen on their $2 billion lifeline. Inside Mark's company headquarters, executives huddled in urgent calls. Voices overlapped, papers rustled, and someone shouted, "Shut the door." It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was survival. The deal that promised to rescue them from collapse was suddenly frozen, its future dangling on one humiliating mistake at 30,000 feet. Emails with the subject line urgent lit up inboxes. Public relations demanded clarity. Legal warned of exposure. Finance whispered about bankruptcy if the deal died. Every department moved as if fire had broken out in the building. Yet the spark hadn't come from Wall Street or regulators. It had come from a uniformed flight attendant deciding her word outweighed a black woman's proof. On private calls, board members spoke in clipped tones. This isn't operational necessity. This is a disaster. Another voice cut in, sharp with fear. We cannot lose her. Without Parker Technologies, we're finished. Silence followed. Everyone knew it was true. The irony was brutal. The company had spent months bending over backward to impress Valerie, offering terms, concessions, promises of future partnership. Yet all that goodwill shattered in seconds because one smirking negotiator let prejudice slide unchecked in a luxury cabin. Meanwhile, the airline itself scrambled. The clip had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views. Comment sections boiled with outrage. Same story, different day. System says otherwise equals code for racism. This woman bought her seat. Why wasn't that enough? Their corporate social team typed frantic drafts of a statement, but no word seemed strong enough to cool the fire. They knew too well, once a story like this takes off, you don't control it, you chase it. Mark sat frozen in his seat, watching his phone fill with desperate instructions. Fix this. Apologize. Make it go away. But how do you erase humiliation that the entire world had just witnessed? He wasn't sure. And worse, he realized Valerie hadn't even spoken yet. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't issued a demand. She had only made one quiet call. If that single call could send their company into tailspin, what would happen when she actually chose to speak? The cabin hummed on, still cloaked in awkward silence. But in the world outside, executives were sweating through their shirts. Investors were dialing each other in panic, and entire careers were already collapsing. And then Valerie's phone lit up again. This time, she wasn't the one receiving calls. She was making them. Valerie sat in the narrow space between the aisle and the polished armrest, her ticket still folded neatly in her lap like a piece of evidence no one cared to see. To the rest of first class, she was simply the woman told she didn't belong. A passenger shuffled out of her seat, humiliated, ignored. But inside her calm exterior, the gears of power had already begun to turn. She pressed a single number on her phone, not scrolling, not searching, just dialing from memory. The line barely rang once before a deep, familiar voice answered. The chairman, the man who had built Mark's company from the ground up, the one still trusted as its backbone. And more importantly, a man who had mentored Valerie years ago, when she was carving her own path. She spoke softly, so soft the passengers leaning forward with curiosity couldn't catch a word. Her tone carried no anger, only precision. I need you to freeze everything, she said. There was no hesitation, no explanation, just a command dressed as a request. On the other end, silence stretched, then came the clip response. Consider it done. Within seconds, dominoes began to fall in the corporate world. The $2 billion deal, lifeline for Mark's crumbling firm, was no longer moving forward. On Wall Street, that kind of delay was the same as a death sentence. Mark's phone buzzed violently on his tray table. He glanced at the screen, his smirk faltering. A single text typed in frantic urgency from his CEO. Stop whatever is happening. Do not provoke her further. Do you understand? His throat went dry. He realized the woman standing quietly beside him wasn't just some passenger. She wasn't just an obstacle on a plane. She was the one person who could decide whether his company survived the quarter. But to the rest of the cabin, none of that was visible. They only saw a black woman shuffled aside by a flight attendant and a man in a rumpled suit taking her seat without protest. To them, Valerie looked small, maybe even defeated. They had no idea that while she stood in silence, entire balance sheets were collapsing in real time. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Years of training, degrees, titles, and boardroom battles, all invisible now under the weight of a single uniform's word. Yet Valerie didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove anything to the strangers around her. Her proof was playing out in back channels, invisible but devastating. Mark fumbled, pretending to adjust his jacket, but his mind was racing. Should he confront her? Should he apologize? Every option felt dangerous. He thought he had cornered her. Instead, she had cornered him, and the walls were closing in. Valerie slipped her phone back into her bag, her face unreadable. She didn't explain herself to the flight attendant, didn't defend her right to the seat. She simply let the silence hang, an invisible weight pressing down on the man across the aisle who now avoided her gaze. Passengers still whispered. A woman in pearls muttered that rules were rules. A man in a business vest leaned to his neighbor and said she should have just moved without making a scene. They didn't know the scene wasn't happening in 2A. It was happening in skyscrapers, in trading floors, in the desperate hearts of executives dialing phones that no longer answered. The flight pushed on, but the cabin air had shifted. The humiliation they thought they witnessed was transforming into something else, something harder to name. Valerie's stillness carried a charge, like a storm gathering in silence before it breaks. Mark's phone buzzed again. He finally dared to glance. This time, the message wasn't frantic. It was brutal. She froze the deal. You've put us in jeopardy. His vision blurred. His breath caught. He looked at Valerie, finally seeing not a passenger, but the architect of his ruin. And yet, she still hadn't said a word to him. The passengers thought the confrontation was over. But Valerie had only just begun. Because when she finally opened her mouth, it wasn't to reclaim a seat. It was to put the entire system on trial. The cabin was still buzzing with whispers, but Valerie's voice cut through it in a way that was almost unnerving. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Calm words can wound sharper than shouting ever will. And in that moment, she shifted the ground under everyone's feet. This isn't about me, she said, her gaze steady. Not on Karen, not even on Mark, but on the silent crowd watching. It's about a system that tells people like her, she nodded toward the uniform still hovering nearby, that black success must be a mistake, that a black woman in this seat can only be here by accident, never by merit. The words landed heavy. Some passengers looked down at their shoes, ashamed. Others tightened their jaws as if she was speaking a truth they'd rather keep buried. And isn't that the ugly part of it? You can show your ticket. You can show your credentials. You can show years of work, sacrifice, achievement. But one uniform, one smirk, one dismissive glance, and all of it is erased. Because one role carries more weight than years of experience. Because the system is designed to believe the uniform over the individual, no matter the proof in their hands. Think about that for a second. Have you ever shown evidence, clear and solid, only for someone to brush aside? Not because it wasn't real, but because they couldn't accept that you were real? That was the heart of Valerie's message. This wasn't about a mistaken seat assignment. It was about a culture where prejudice hides behind a mask of operational necessity, where the word random becomes a weapon used to justify humiliation, where discretion means deciding who belongs and who doesn't, and black people are too often placed on the wrong side of that line. The audience in first class shifted uncomfortably. They were sitting in luxury leather seats, sipping champagne, yet suddenly the space felt claustrophobic, almost suffocating. Valerie had turned the cabin itself into a courtroom, with every passenger forced into the role of silent juror. And here's what made it even more piercing. Valerie wasn't pleading. She wasn't trying to win sympathy. She was stating facts, exposing a pattern, dismantling the illusion that this was a one-off. She stood there, her calm voice the sharpest indictment anyone could deliver. Mark shifted uneasily now. His smirk had died long ago, but this was worse, because Valerie wasn't just holding the deal hostage anymore. She was holding a mirror to the very system that had given him his sense of superiority. And Karen, the flight attendant who had started all this? Her face was pale, her posture stiff. For the first time, she looked like she wanted to disappear, because Valerie's words had moved past her. She was no longer just Karen, a single employee. She had become a symbol, an embodiment of something much larger. Passengers glanced at her and then back at Valerie, realizing they weren't watching a passenger versus crew dispute anymore. They were watching history repeat itself. A cycle of dismissal, humiliation, and erasure, all crammed into the luxury walls of a first-class cabin. Valerie paused, letting the silence stretch. Then she added, "One uniform carried more weight than years of achievement. That's not an accident. That's the design." Her words were a blade cutting through the illusion of fairness. And for a moment, it seemed like the air had been sucked out of the plane. People weren't just looking at her anymore. They were looking at themselves, forced to ask, "What side am I on?" And that's when she turned slightly, as if to leave her words hanging in the air. But instead, she added one last line, soft yet chilling. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The passengers froze, eyes wide, waited to see what she meant. Because the question now wasn't whether Valerie would win. It was what she would demand next. Valerie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power doesn't always shout. It whispers and still echoes. After freezing a $2 billion deal with a single phone call, she knew exactly what needed to happen next. The airline executives thought they were dealing with a passenger grievance. They were wrong. This wasn't about one seat or one humiliation. This was about a system that let uniforms override truth, that gave operational necessity more weight than dignity, and that treated black excellence like an error in the manifest. She leaned back in her temporary seat, phone pressed lightly to her ear, and spoke clearly. "This is what's going to happen," she said. Her tone was calm, almost casual, but every word landed like a gavel in a courtroom. First, she demanded a formal apology, not a half-hearted press release, not the shallow, "we regret your experience" line corporations toss around like candy. A real apology, direct, public, and specific, the kind of apology that makes shareholders sweat. Second, she laid out something bigger, systemic change inside the airline itself. "You will review your training," she said. "You will redefine how discretion is used. Because discretion without accountability is just prejudice in uniform." The silence on the other end of the line was proof they understood exactly what she meant. But Valerie wasn't done. The third demand went deeper, cutting into the boardroom culture that had always pretended inclusion was optional. She required equity initiatives tied directly to corporate governance. That meant seats at the table, not symbolic ones, but voting power. She wanted measurable commitments to diversity on the board, policies written in ink, not brochures. And here's the part that made the executives squirm the most. She didn't frame any of it as a request. She wasn't asking for favors. She wasn't bargaining. She made it plain. These were the non-negotiable terms for any hope of repairing the damage. Passengers around her still saw only a woman displaced from her seat, scrolling calmly through her phone. They didn't see the storm she was unleashing in private. They didn't hear the panic in the voices on the other end of the call, or the rushed typing of assistants scrambling to draft statements before the plane even took off. But you, sitting here listening, let me ask you, if this were you, stripped of your dignity in front of a full cabin, would you have demanded the same? Or would you have accepted a voucher, a shrug, in silence? Some viewers will argue she pushed too far. It was one mistake, one flight attendant. Why ruin a company over it? But others will say she didn't push far enough. Because if billion-dollar institutions can humiliate a black CEO in broad daylight, what chance does an everyday passenger have at justice? That's the question her ultimatum exposed. It wasn't just about Valerie anymore. It was about the system itself, and whether that system could survive being called out by someone who refused to play the role of silent victim. The executives on the other end of the call thought they could negotiate her down. They thought they could buy time with vague promises. But Valerie cut through it all. Her last words before hanging up were sharp enough to freeze the room. "You don't have until next week. You don't even have until tomorrow. You have until this plane lands." And with that, the cabin grew even quieter, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of the deadline she had just drawn. What would the airline and Mark's company do next? Fight back or fold completely? By the time the plane leveled off above the clouds, the battle was already over. The airline and Mark's company had fought to hold their ground, but the weight of public outrage and corporate survival crushed their resistance in record time. At airline headquarters, a war room had formed in minutes. Executives barked orders into phones. Interns sprinted with half-finished drafts of apologies, and legal teams begged communications to soften the language. But nothing sounded strong enough. Every phrase fell hollow. We regret the misunderstanding. Delete. We value all customers equally. Delete. The truth was uglier. Their employee had humiliated a black woman in first class, and the world had seen it. Meanwhile, in Mark's corporate tower, the collapse was complete. The bailout they had depended on, $2 billion of oxygen, was gone unless Valerie said otherwise. The chairman himself had already conceded. Valerie's terms weren't requests. They were lifelines. To refuse them meant bankruptcy, layoffs, headlines that would destroy more than reputation. So they folded. Quietly, desperately, but completely. The deal would continue, but under new terms. Her terms. Equity commitments tied to governance. Systemic reforms that reached from boardroom to gate. And most painful of all for them, the acknowledgement that the power dynamic had flipped forever. Think about that for a second. In less than an hour, what began as one flight attendant's Operation Necessity had grown into an international firestorm, and a multi-billion-dollar company bent its knee. Do you see the irony? A black woman stripped of her seat in row 2 ended up rewriting the rules for the very people who tried to erase her. Back on the plane, none of that chaos was visible. Passengers saw only a tense cabin and a quiet woman scrolling her phone. But behind the scenes, the walls of two empires had cracked. The flight attendant who once stood tall now avoided eye contact. Her authority dissolved like mist. Mark sat rigid, phone buzzing nonstop, his earlier smirk replaced with something closer to fear. He knew it, he had lost. And yet, Valerie hadn't celebrated. She hadn't gloated. She simply sat still, calm as stone, letting the storm play itself out. Because here's the truth. Power doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes silence is the loudest declaration. But the story wasn't finished. The surrender was only the beginning. The real consequences, the visible punishments, the public reckoning, the names and faces forced into accountability, were still waiting just beyond the landing. And as the cabin lights dimmed, passengers whispered the same unspoken question. When this plane touched down, who would still have a job, and who would be gone? When the plane touched down in San Francisco, the silence inside the cabin was louder than the engines. The passengers had witnessed humiliation, resistance, and then something far stranger. The collapse of two powerful institutions, all sparked by one woman's quiet strength. But the story wasn't done. By the time Valerie stepped off the jet bridge, the video had already gone viral. Clips of her standing tall, phone in hand, refusing to explode while being stripped of her seat. Those images spread like wildfire. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Seat2A, hashtag not a mistake, hashtag Black Excellence denied. People weren't just angry. They were moved. They saw dignity in the face of open disrespect, and they wanted justice. The airline couldn't contain the damage. Within hours, a statement hit the press. The crew member involved has been placed on immediate leave pending investigation. We know what that really meant. Karen was gone. Discretion no longer protected her. The very operational necessity she once used as a weapon was now being used to erase her from the system. And then came the apologies, layered, frantic, and hollow. First from the airline CEO, who promised to review protocols. Then from Mark's company, whose public relations team scrambled to distance themselves. We deeply regret the incident, they wrote, as if regret could rewrite what the world had already seen. But here's the twist. The apology wasn't what people remembered. It was the image, the still frame of Valerie in the aisle, calm, steady, unshaken. That photo became a symbol, plastered across timelines, blogs, and even the evening news. People began calling it the look that froze $2 billion. Think about that. A black woman, denied the seat she had already earned, ended up becoming an icon not because she shouted, but because she didn't need to. She showed the world that silence, when backed by true power, can be the loudest response of all. But as Valerie slipped into her waiting car, shielded by tinted glass, a bigger question hovered in the air. If one video could shake an airline and a corporation in a single day, what kind of storm would hit once the ripple effects began? The video of Valerie standing calm and composed while the flight attendant unraveled spread like fire through dry grass. It was replayed on morning shows, dissected on podcasts, and argued about in boardrooms. For some, it was a clear sign of racism in action. For others, it was dismissed as a random mistake, an operation necessity gone wrong. But that phrase, random mistake, quickly became the most dangerous excuse of them all. Within days, the airline found itself in survival mode. Their PR team pushed out apologies, promising discretion and improved training. But passengers weren't buying it. Frequent flyers began questioning how many other times this had happened to someone who didn't have a billion-dollar deal in her hands. How many black travelers had been humiliated without a camera rolling to prove it? Behind the scenes, something bigger was happening. Corporate boards and industries far outside aviation took notice. Executives whispered about what they called the Valerie effect. They realized one employee's bias, left unchecked, could cost billions in lost partnerships and reputational damage. Suddenly, diversity and equity weren't framed as nice-to-have talking points in annual reports. They were survival tools. Policies started shifting. Airlines rushed to retrain flight crews, adding new rules that limited staff discretion when passengers presented clear evidence like valid tickets or IDs. Lawmakers hinted at hearings, asking whether customer service policies had quietly enabled discrimination under the cover of operational necessity. Even competing companies in tech and finance began to examine how their gatekeepers, from receptionists to security, decided who was treated as an insider and who as an intruder. Meanwhile, online debate raged. Some insisted Valerie had overreacted, that freezing a $2 billion deal over one bad apple was too extreme. Others pushed back hard. If you think this is about one attendant, you're not paying attention. This is about how black excellence gets treated like fraud every single day. The clash of perspectives only fueled more tension, pulling more people into the story. And then came the unexpected ripple. Employees inside the airline began leaking stories, other complaints, other names, other humiliations that had been buried under corporate silence. What started as one confrontation in Row 2A was fast becoming a reckoning. The company could no longer hide behind isolated incidents. It was systemic, and the world was watching. For Valerie, the storm wasn't just about her anymore. She had sparked a wave she could no longer control. Every interview, every news headline carried her name, but also a bigger question. How many more Valeries had been silenced before? And just when it seemed like the dust might settle, a chilling new detail surfaced, one that tied Valerie's personal victory to something much larger and far more dangerous. Weeks later, the airport looked the same. The polished floors, the endless announcements echoing over the speakers, the subtle divide between those rushing to the economy line and those gliding toward first class. But for Valerie Parker, everything felt different now. The memory of that humiliating morning still lived inside her body, but so did something else. Something heavier, sharper, power. She walked through the lounge, dressed not in a flashy way, but with the quiet authority of someone who no longer had to prove anything. The staff at the counter recognized her name before she even handed over her boarding pass. "Welcome back, Miss Parker," the agent said, her tone carefully respectful, almost reverent. No smirk, no hesitation, just recognition. Valerie nodded politely, but inside she felt the irony twist like a knife. Respect now, but only after exposure, only after the system had been burned. When she stepped onto the plane, the same cabin that had once humiliated her became her stage of redemption. The rows of leather seats gleamed under the soft cabin light. Attendants stood straighter when she passed. One even offered a nervous smile, the kind that said, "We know who you are now, and we won't make that mistake again." It was a correction, yes, but also a confession. They had to learn the hard way. And yet, that was the truth of it, wasn't it? It had taken a viral video, a frozen $2 billion deal, and a CEO pulling invisible strings for the world to finally treat her as what she already was. A paying customer, a rightful passenger, a leader in her field. Not an intruder, not an imposter. The cabin's quiet luxury wrapped around her, but Valerie's mind was restless. How many others, nameless and faceless, had been humiliated in silence? How many had no chairman to call, no billion-dollar deal to freeze, no phone number that could shake an entire corporate empire? The answer was too many. Far too many. And here's the part no press release wanted to admit. This wasn't about one airline or one flight attendant. This was about a culture baked deep into operational necessity, into random checks, into policy discretion. Fancy word hiding an ugly truth, that the burden always seemed to fall heavier on certain shoulders. Imagine being told, with a smile, that you don't belong. Imagine being asked to prove, again and again, that you deserve a seat you already paid for. Imagine every glance questioning your presence, every pause daring you to justify your right to exist in spaces meant to be elite. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. And Valerie's stand ripped that pattern wide open. After her story went viral, airlines across the country scrambled, training manuals rewritten, diversity audits launched, executives whispering in boardrooms, not out of conscience, but out of fear. Fear of the next headline, fear of the next video, fear of the next Valerie Parker, who wouldn't stay quiet. But here's the question that lingers. Will real change come from fear, or will it fade the moment the cameras turn away? Because systems have a way of repairing themselves, of smoothing over scandal until the old habits return. Will this be remembered as a turning point, or just another headline in the cycle of outrage? You, the viewer, are part of that answer. Silence isn't neutral. Silence is permission. When stories like Valerie's are told, they force accountability. They force uncomfortable questions. They remind the powerful that someone is always watching, always recording, always ready to expose the gap between their polished promises and their hidden actions. So ask yourself, if this happened to you, with no camera rolling, no billion-dollar deal hanging in the balance, what protection would you really have? Who would believe you? And would your dignity still matter if no one with power was forced to care? Valerie sat in her seat, calm as ever, sipping water as the engines roared to life. To the other passengers, she looked like any other business traveler. But she knew what they didn't, that her quiet resistance had shifted the air. Her presence in that cabin wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told, in subtle or public ways, you don't belong here. And maybe that's the real victory, not the frozen deal, not the public apologies, not even the reforms that would follow. The victory was in breaking the silence, in refusing to let humiliation become the final word, in forcing the world to see what it preferred to ignore. So let me ask you, if silence allows this cycle to repeat, then what's your role in breaking it? Will you be the passenger who looks away, relieved it isn't happening to you? Or will you be the witness who says, no, this isn't right? Stories like Valerie's must be told, because they remind us that injustice thrives in quiet, that arrogance hides behind uniforms and titles, and that power is never given. It's revealed, sometimes in the unlikeliest of moments, like on a morning flight meant to be a victory lap. Subscribe, not just for another story, but to stand in a community that refuses to stay quiet. And if you won't subscribe, then tell us why in the comments. Because silence is never neutral. Silence is a choice,